They do have a timeout. Decide not to use it. Curry, way downtown. Bang! Bang! Oh, what a shot from Curry!
What's up, everybody? My name is Ethan. This is Courtside TV. If you're new, don't forget to subscribe, and let's get into it. So, today I have a little bit of a different topic for you all. I wanted to talk about the rapidly increasing positive tests within the NBA right now, how multiple teams are currently have a ton of players in quarantine and self-isolation and all sorts of stuff. It seems like there's sort of an outbreak mounting, and every morning we're getting more word that more teams are having to lose guys for 7 to 10 days due to contact tracing and quarantining and all of that stuff, right? So I kind of wanted to talk about this, what the impact might be for specific teams throughout the year, and what the NBA might have to do about this, considering that it's really increased rapidly within the last 3 or 4 days or so. And so what that might mean for the rest of this season, what's going to happen really to all of these teams that are missing players. And so yeah, let's just get into that. So this all kind of started with a positive test for Seth Curry from the 76ers. It was reported that he had tested positive shortly after the game tipped off. They got the results back of his test, and he was not playing that night anyway. He had some ankle thing, and so he was inactive for the game, but he was still sitting on the bench around the team. He was immediately pulled from the arena, left separately, and tried to stay away from all of his teammates. But they had to list a bunch of guys as close contacts to him. They had to sit out for the game, and the 76ers only had 7 active players that they had to go into a game with. But according to the NBA rules this season, you have to have a minimum of 8 players that are active in order to be able to play a game. And the Sixers did have 8 active, but one of them was injured. That was Mike Scott, and he did not play. So they ended up having to go into a game with 7 players. To their credit, they actually played pretty well. Tyrese Maxey had a good game, and they at least kept it competitive, kept it a close game against the Denver Nuggets. They ended up losing, but they just kind of were put in a really, really tough scenario. And then after that, we had a lot more go down where the Dallas Mavericks now have a bunch of players in quarantine due to Maxi Kleber, I believe, tested positive, as well as the Boston Celtics. Jason Tatum is going to be out for 7 to 10 days. He's tested positive as well, and they have a bunch of guys, a bunch of their centers are out due to contact tracing. Like we said, they only had a couple of guys available at that big man spot. That's Taco Fall and Daniel Tice were able to play. So we got a lot more Taco Fall minutes and stuff because the Celtics had a bunch of guys out due to contact tracing, as well as the Miami Heat had some guys out due to contact tracing tonight. I don't believe we know who on the Heat is causing all of this, causing the tracing and everything, and what prompted that. They said Avery Bradley's going to be out. And then that game ended up getting canceled. The Celtics and Heat were supposed to play Sunday evening, and that game ended up getting, I guess not canceled, but postponed to a later date, which to this point we don't know when that's going to be. And that marks the second game this season that will have to have been postponed from its original date, following the Rockets and Thunder game from opening night, which was pushed back to sometime in the future. So now that's like 5 teams that have had large groups of their players out due to contact tracing, and that's not even mentioning Kevin Durant of the Brooklyn Nets, who just had to miss a week. And that's not even anything to do with the team. He apparently was just around somebody in his personal life who had tested positive, and he was Kevin Durant had to be out for a couple of days, even though he had already had the virus back when the thing first started. If you remember, like right when the season was getting suspended, a couple of Nets players ended up having it, and one of them was Kevin Durant. And so he has to now quarantine. Well, I guess he's back at this point, but he missed, I believe, 2 or 3 games. So all of this is escalating rather quickly for the NBA, because through the first couple of weeks they were getting off pretty well. Like they only had a few players test positive. None of them really affected game dates except for that opening night game, but for about 3-4 weeks from then until now, it's been pretty smooth sailing for the league. And now at this point they've had to cancel another game today, and I definitely think there could be more coming, considering how fast this seems to be spreading from team to team. And it's going to be interesting to see where this goes from here. And we said before the season that positive tests are going to be a big factor in determining where teams finish in the standings. And now we're kind of starting to see the actual impact that this can have, because the Brooklyn Nets have been struggling recently. Not only are they missing Kevin Durant, well, I guess not anymore, he's back now, but they were missing him for a couple games. Kyrie Irving has been out for personal reasons. I don't believe that's related to the virus in any way, but losing those two players, the Nets have been struggling. And then obviously the Celtics missing Jason Tatum for the next couple of games, that's going to significantly impact them. He's their best player. I picked him to win the MVP this season, so that's going to be a big impact on the Celtics as their team. And pretty much everywhere else, right? Everywhere around the league, if your star player goes out for a couple weeks, you're going to be in a bad spot. And I was just thinking about this, right? With seeing all of this going down over the weekend, you guys know I'm a Warriors fan, and so I was thinking well, what if Steph Curry had to miss 2 weeks, right? That puts the Warriors in a pretty bad spot. And you could say the same about a lot of other superstars, right? What about Damian Lillard if he misses 2 weeks for the Portland Trailblazers? What about, the Lakers if LeBron James and Anthony Davis both get caught up in contact racing? They're not going to be very good for a while. Kawhi Leonard, Paul George with the Clippers. You can go up and down the league, right? And see that, how much these teams might be affected by star players missing a couple weeks. And it doesn't even have to be that they themselves are positive. They could have just been around somebody, and it might not be, any fault of their own whatsoever, right? Like, say a guy, his wife has to go to work, right? Or his kids are in school, and they're going to be, around, maybe one of their classmates is tested positive, and they get it from one of their classmates. Maybe one of your kids, picks it up from school, stuff like that. And so it can just be sort of random, really. There's no... Like we've known this throughout this entire pandemic here in the US and around the world, that you can be the most careful person and still end up getting it, or have somebody close to you end up getting it. So it's definitely a tough scenario for the league and for the players, because it can just be completely random through no fault of your own, and all of a sudden your star is out for 2 weeks, and the team might struggle for that entire time. And so I don't think, specifically myself and also a lot of other NBA fans, I don't think we really internalize this enough, that that could really be a make or break thing for certain teams, especially teams that are on the playoff bubble, trying to make it in. Just for an example, right? Charlotte Hornets, they're going to be probably on the bubble in the playoffs in the Eastern Conference. They're going to be challenging for that 9th, 10th, 11th seed, right? They're going to be in that mix there. So what happens if, Gordon Hayward, LaMelo Ball, Terry Rozier have to miss some time, and, you lose 4 or 5 games in a row? That can really put you a step down when compared to a lot of the other teams who might not have to deal with something like that. So that's just one example, but I would be a little concerned if I was any team, if I was any fan of any team in the league, really, just because it can hit you at any time, and it can be really devastating if it happens. And so what does the league do about this? Well, we had reports today that the NBA does not have any sort of plans to, stop the season for a certain period of time, or delay, every single game for a little while during this current outbreak that we're in the middle of right now, right? The league has no plans to do anything drastic in order to stop that. And when you really think into the logistics of all of this, it's going to be really interesting to see what the league decides to do here, because say this gets even worse than it is right now, and you have a third of the league has a ton of players out due to contact tracing. Say 10 teams are barely scraping by with enough players to go to games every single night, and it's just getting worse. Well, what's the league's option there, really? Because you can't just push every single game back for the rest of the year. That's just not how it works, right? You can't, just take everything and say, okay, well, instead of January 10th, we're going to play on January 17th. And then so on and so forth, right? Just push the entire season back. You can't really do that because of, the way that travel works. There's, the arenas might be booked for something else. There's all sorts of logistical things, and that's why the season is planned out so far in advance. You can't just really do that, right? So they would have to maybe say, hey, this, we're going to take 7 days off, and all the games that happen in this 7-day span are going to happen at the end of the season. So say, the next 3 games for a certain team are against the Lakers, the Clippers, and the Warriors, right? Instead of pushing those games all back a week, you would take that 3-game chunk and put it at the end of the season instead. That would really be the only thing that you would be able to do is, like just basically take a chunk of games and then move it to a different time period and then just pick back up with the current schedule the way it's currently structured after a certain period of time when, you have to say, quarantine everybody in the league for 10 days, and then you would move that 10-day chunk to the end of the year. And there is some flexibility built into the way this season is structured because the NBA only announced the first half of the season, the schedule for the first half of the season through, I believe, around when the All-Star break is supposed to be taking place. Now, there is no All-Star game, but there is still the break. So they have, that long, and then the second half of the year is going to be filled with whatever games have to be made up, and then obviously the rest of the team's normal schedule. But if the league did have to take, 10 days off right now, then they would have to build that sort of schedule into that chunk. But that would also have to sort of push back what they have planned for the playoffs, right? Like, say they had to, squeeze in, 3 or 4 more games for every single team. The playoffs, I believe, are supposed to happen. The finals are going to end like in the middle of July rather than June this year. So that would obviously push everything back a couple of weeks for the playoffs. Is that possible? Probably, but I'm sure they don't want to have to go there. So that's something to think about, right? Do they have to push back the playoffs for all of this? Or, the most drastic option would be like if every team had to start having a ton of games canceled, then you would have to like just say, hey, instead of 72, we're gonna play 65, right? Just say, hey, unfortunately every single team had to have things canceled, and so we're just gonna cut 5 or 6 games from the schedule. Every team, you're playing 65 now instead of 72, and it just is what it is. So that's another thing to possibly think about them doing if it really gets to the point where they have to start canceling and postponing a ton of games. And then the other thing that I wonder if they'll consider, and maybe it's too late for this and it's probably something they should have considered over the offseason, but just the idea of expanding rosters just in general for every team across the league, right? They didn't end up expanding, the amount of players that you can have on a team's roster at all this year. As we know, right now you can have 15 players on your roster and then 2 two-way guys. So that's 17 players total, up to 17 that can be, active and playing games for your team. And as of right now, just with the way that contact tracing works, teams are having 7 or 8 players that are out, due to contact tracing, and so that leaves you with only 7 or 8 guys left, and you're supposed to have 8 to be able to play a game. And so it just puts you in a really, really tough scenario because there's a really thin margin for error, and we're already seeing it with like 3 or 4 teams this year already, right? Like the Celtics and the Heat both were having struggles getting to enough players, and that's why their game got postponed from yesterday, as well as the Philadelphia 76ers barely met that criteria. So, potentially could the league consider saying, hey, we're going to expand team rosters. You can have, 17 normal guys in addition to your two-ways, so that, that pushes them up, so that, even if you have a lot of guys in contact tracing, you could potentially have more guys available to add on game day. And that would create a lot, a big, almost a second free agency happening in the middle of the season, which would be something kind of crazy to work out. I don't think the league will go this route, but that would be really, really interesting to see, if every team in the NBA is all of a sudden able to add 2 more players in terms of depth to their roster. What does that do? Maybe we could see some more trades going down, or teams obviously would be signing a bunch of guys and then they would have to go through quarantines in order to join the roster. But maybe that's something to consider if it continues to be an issue for teams not being able to have enough guys be active on game day. They allow every team in the league to add a couple more guys to their roster, just so that you can have enough guys to be able to go. Again, that's something that would probably have to have been worked out in the offseason, and there probably is issues with the CBA and all that stuff that makes that pretty hard to pull off at this point. But I don't know, that's just maybe something to think about. So yeah, this is just a really interesting scenario. This is the first time the NBA has really had to grapple with this, just because of the success of the bubble, over the summer. They didn't have to deal with any positive tests for players while they were in the bubble. That didn't result in any games being postponed or canceled or any of that. The NBA got very fortunate that that was able to happen. But now, you know, the NFL had to deal with postponing games, so did the MLB, and leagues around the world, right, have all had to deal with the effects of this, and now it's the NBA's turn to really deal with it, and they're in the middle of their first big outbreak. This was, you know, eventually inevitable, right? For as careful as they could have been, this stuff sort of happens, and it just is the way that the world works these days, right? At least until enough people can end up getting a vaccine and we can finally be out of this pandemic. But for right now, this is the reality of the world that we live in, and so hopefully for the players and hopefully for the league, they'll be able to, you know, figure out maybe some new protocols put in place to make things even safer for everybody. And then, you know, potentially looking at some rule changes or a postponement would be something that, you know, it would have to be a drastic option, but I'm sure the league is motivated to keep things rolling, and so we'll have to see what they do over the next couple of weeks. If things start to get worse, you know, hopefully they don't, but yeah, I mean, it'll be interesting to see how everything unfolds. Anyway, that's about all I have for you today on the state of the league right now. Like I said at the top of the video, if you're new, don't forget to subscribe, leave a like, ring the bell if you want to, leave a comment letting me know what you think about this whole situation, about, you know, certain teams getting games postponed and you know, being forced to play with only 7 or 8 active players on the roster. I'm sure the Sixers were not happy about having to do that. You know, there's lots of you know, sides to this issue, and so I'd love to know what your thoughts are. But yeah, with all that said, I will see you guys in the next one.